Yeah, we're still about 3 degrees away from full nose down trim. And I am using everything that I have.
My God.
Hi everybody, very welcome to Mentour and yet another video podcast. As always, I hope you're doing absolutely fantastic. Today on the video, guys, I'm going to talk about a condition known as mistrim. A condition that makes it very, very hard to manually trim the stabilizer of the 737. I'll tell you what causes it and what can be done to solve it. And at the end, I will also answer a question that a lot of you guys asked me about last week's video about the terrain escape maneuver. So stay tuned.
Wind 31016, everyone right, right on. Third land, 31 right. Delta 260. See you later, dude.
This video is brought to you in cooperation with our sponsor NordVPN. Now, if you're like me and you travel all over the world using public Wi-Fi, well then you definitely need the services of NordVPN to keep your data secure and to make sure that you can always access those favorite series of yours, even though you might be behind regional firewalls. Those of you who uses this link here below, together with the coupon code PILOT, will get a 75% off on their 3-year plan plus 1 month off. So check it out.
Higher and higher as well. So it will become almost impossible to move it. But so now we are at about 3 degrees. Yeah, we're still about 3 degrees away from full nose down trim. And I am using everything that I have.
My God.
Right, guys, so mistrim. Now, in order to understand this, you have to understand how the trim system of the 737 works. Now, I've done a video about the trim system previously, and I'll link to it up here. But if you're interested in this, if you're interested in getting kind of updates on, things that's going on in the aviation world or explanations of how the 737, but basically anything in the aviation world works, well then make sure that you've subscribed to the channel and that you've highlighted the notification bell, because if you haven't, you might not get these updates when I'm sending out new videos. So, the 737 trim system works like this. You have a jack screw in the front of the stabilizer. The stabilizer is the entire back wing of the aircraft. In the front here, there's a jack screw connected. Now, that moves the whole stabilizer up and down through a pivot point. Okay. What's moving the jack screw is, in most cases, an electrical motor. So it's a single electrical motor that can be activated either by the pilots by using the thumb switch on the yoke, or by the autopilot who is doing the same thing, essentially. Now, the pilots can only activate the trim if we're flying manually. If we actually activate the trim while the autopilot is engaged, that disengages the autopilot. So in most conditions, when you see that the stab trim, that's just the trim just next to the captain on the right and the first officer on the left, when you see that moving, it's either being activated by the pilots or by a system called speed trim system. Okay, and we're talking about the 737NG here. So it's a speed trim system or the pilots, or if the autopilot is engaged, the autopilot is doing it. And the reason that we have the trim system at all is because we're operating in a lot of different speeds. And depending on what speed we're operating in, the forces on the elevator and the aircraft will be different. So let's say that I want to climb. Well, in that case, I will take my yoke and I'll pull it backwards. That will deflect an elevator surface on the back of the stabilizer like this. It will create a downforce, and since you have a downforce in the back, that will move the nose of the aircraft up, right? But of course, if I only had the elevator, that would mean that if I wanted to climb consistently, I would have to sit with the same kind of back pressure to make sure that the aircraft keeps climbing. And the amount of back pressure needed is going to change if I'm at, say, 220 knots after takeoff, go to 250 up to 300 knots for the climb potentially. This changes. Okay, the same is when you guys move around. When you've had, your meal, your coffee and your glass of wine and you want to go to the toilet, there's a long queue at the front. Well, if there's a long queue at the front, it means that a lot of people is in the front, which means more back pressure needed. So we need to be able to trim those forces away, and we do that through the stabilizer. All right, so far this is very similar to the video that I already did. But in some cases, the electrical motor might not be doing the job we want it to do. or there might be some other system interfering. And in that case, if the pilots feel that we're not happy with what the stabilizer is doing, we do something called a runaway stabilizer memory items and a runaway stabilizer checklist. Okay, I've also done a video about that. You can check it out how it's done. But what you have to understand, and why this video is a little bit different, is that depending on what speed you have, when you get to the last part of the runaway stabilizer checklist, it tells the pilots to trim the aircraft manually. Okay, so this is different from using the thumb switch. This means that we actually have to turn the trim wheel manually, because the 737 has something which is fairly unique to modern aircraft, and that is that you actually have physical wires moving from the trim wheel down under the floor of the cockpit, all the way through the back of the aircraft, out through the bulkhead, aft bulkhead, to the jack screw. So close to the jack screw, you have a drum, which this wire is kind of rolled around, and then it goes back up to the cockpit. So as you're moving the stabilizer manually, if you now fall out the handles and you start trimming the aircraft manually, what you're doing is you're using pure muscle force in order to move the stabilizer. As you can imagine, you're now moving, several meters of wire, and you only have a very little kind of pivot point to move around. So you are potentially going to need quite a lot of force. Now, during normal speeds, when there's no much forces acting on the stabilizer, it will be perfectly doable. It's easy. But, and this is something to remember, even if it is fairly in trim or fairly low speed, it's still much more slower. So as you're moving the stabilizer, you are going to move it at a much slower pace than the electrical motor would. Okay? Good. But now we're getting to the point here, which is what I'm going to show you here in the video in a second as well. So, if you're in a situation now where the aircraft has gotten severely out of trim because of a runaway stabilizer, for example, and the speed has started to increase, well, then you have to understand that any flight control surface will become much more effective at higher speeds. That's because the aerodynamic pressure on the surface doesn't increase linearly like this. It increases exponentially. And this is important to understand, because that means that the forces needed in order to move a flight control surface at 220 knots is very, very different from the forces needed at about 340 knots, which is our VMO. So, if you have the stabilizer like this, you have the jack screw moving here in order to move the entire surface. And at the back, you have the elevator moving. Okay. Let's say that the pilot flying is now forcing a severe down trim movement. This would mean that the pilot flying is holding a lot of back pressure to hold the aircraft at level flight. The way that the elevator is now deflected is like this. Because remember, it's trying to create a down force here to move the nose of the aircraft up. So it's deflected like this. The jack screw is here. And remember, if you want to trim out this, what you want to do is you want to move the entire stabilizer like this, so that the entire stabilizer is now angled in order to create a down force. But since you have the pivot point here, the elevator is here, the elevator is actually causing a force that moves the stabilizer the other direction. Okay? And this is going to put a lot of pressure on the jack screw. So if you're sitting at high speed, like this, with the elevator deflected like that, you are going to need an enormous amount of force in order to move the stabilizer this way. Okay, this is essentially what a mistrim situation looks like. Okay, now I'm going to show you now in the simulator how this looks. You have to understand a few things. First of all, this is a 737 NG simulator. I'm not trying to simulate anything else. Okay, also, I am going to artificially put the aircraft into a very out of trim position. That is in order to show you this particular phenomenon. Okay, so this would be well outside of what normal conditions would ever, even non-normal conditions would ever show. But I wanted to show you the aerodynamic implications of a mistrim at high speed. So I will simulate another failure that causes the aircraft to get up into a higher than normal speed. and then we will artificially move the stabilizer trim into a very out of trim position, just to show you the kind of forces needed. Okay, so enjoy.
Okay, so I'm trying to establish this now.
Check. We are descending. We probably. Are you feeling trouble with the any trouble with the flight controls?
Yeah, it's. I'm trying to trim it, but it's continuously trimming against me when I'm trimming. So state the malfunction, please.
Yeah, this doesn't look right. Looks like. How do you feel the stabilizer, the trim system? Can you control it?
I am trimming it, and it is responding, but
it's a runaway stabilizer, if you agree.
For every time that I trim backwards, it keeps trimming forward.
It's going forward. Yeah, it's a runaway stabilizer.
Okay, so runaway stabilizer memory items, and I'm trying to keep this thing at 4 degrees.
Control column, hold firmly.
Oh, I am.
Autopilot, if engaged, disengage.
It is disengaged.
Auto throttle, if engaged, disengage.
It's. If you can disengage it for me, make sure that it's disengaged. Thank you.
Disengaged. And do you feel? Did this the failure stop? Negative.
No, it's still moving.
Start trim cutout switches to cut off. Okay, it stopped. It looks like it stopped.
Okay, as you can see now, I'm using almost full back pressure here.
Exactly.
How many degrees? How many degrees of nose down? Or
we have 4 units nose down now.
4 units nose down.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, 4 units nose up, bitches.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm struggling. I'm actually using almost my full force to keep the aircraft level here.
Do you want me to help you?
What I would like to do, just for the sake of exercise, can you trim it forward and see if we can reach even 0 nose down, and see if I can even hold it. So now we're doing this just as an exercise, guys. Do not try this at home. This is Lorenzo moving the aircraft. We're at 300 knots now.
Fighting.
And I am struggling to keep this aircraft flying.
My God.
Yeah, the thing is that with a higher speed, the forces on the stabilizer will be higher and higher as well. So it will become almost impossible to move it. But so now we are at what, 3 degrees.
Yeah.
We're still about 3 degrees away from full nose down trim. And I am using everything that I have.
My God.
And this is realistic, guys. This is how much of effort it would take to trim the stabilizer at these kind of speeds. I can still control it though, but it is getting harder and harder. And remember, we're still 2.5 degrees away.
My God.
That's not possible, is it? All right, so we'll stop it there. The reason that we have to trim this manually is because the normal trim system would not do this, okay? It would require manual trim to get it away from this. That's fine, all fine. Trim it backwards. Trim it backwards if you can.
Oh my God.
Okay, Johan, press the red button. Press the red button now.
Wow.
Right, guys, so as you could see, it was very, very hard for the first officer to move the stabilizer. Now, it's still possible, all right? If you have a 2-pilot effort, you will be able to move the stabilizer, but it might be very, very hard, and it might be felt like if the stabilizer trim is actually stuck, like it doesn't work. Now, Boeing was well aware of this, all right? And they have been aware about this since the first iterations of the 737. So back in the 1960s, there was actually a description inside of the manual of this particular problem. It said that if you do find yourself in a mistrim position at a higher speed, you have to do one out of 2 things, all right? Probably both. One of the ways to get rid of this is to make sure that you don't have that force from the elevator acting on the jack screw anymore. And the way to do this is to increase the pressure on the elevator, make sure that the nose of the aircraft starts rising, and then let it forward. So let go of the elevator. When you do that, the forces on the jack screw will reduce and you'll be able to momentarily trim the aircraft, in this case backwards. Now, that will go quite slowly, so you might have to do that maneuver over and over again, and that's why Boeing refer to it as a roller coaster maneuver. So where you pull the aircraft up into a slight climb, let it go, the aircraft is now going to pitch forward, you're probably going to get into something close to 0 Gs, and while you are at that position you'll be able to trim the aircraft backwards, and then you'll have to pull it back again, do the same thing again, and eventually you'll get into an in-trim situation. Right, so that's one thing. The other thing is consider reducing speed. Okay, because as you're reducing speed, you might get closer to an in-trim condition even without moving the stabilizer. And also, the forces acting on the flight control surfaces is going to be lower, right? So, consider reducing speed, consider unloading the stabilizer using this roller coaster maneuver. It's also an individual movement like that. It's called a bunt. You might have heard it. You probably have done it as part of your flight training if you've done your PPL or your CPL training. But it is by unloading the forces on the elevator in order to get the trim moving again. So it's in there. It was described in the manuals of the 737-200. Then it kind of moved out into a separate document, which is called the Flight Crew Training Manual, which is where it lies now. All right, it is still there. The Flight Crew Training Manual describes the fact that you will need more force at higher speed and larger out of trim conditions, but it doesn't actually explain the roller coaster maneuver anymore. Okay, but there are ways to get out of it. Right, so if you have questions about that, guys, I really want you to get into the Mentour Aviation app and ask me directly. Just tag @Mentour inside of the chat there, or you can talk to any of the other 737 pilots, Airbus pilots, pilots in training, or flight enthusiasts. It's a great community, and if you want to join up, you have the free download links down here, so please go in there and check it out. Another question that I got a lot during and after last week's video was, why, during the terrain escape maneuver, why didn't you just turn? All right, it's a great question. Let's have a look at the terrain escape maneuver in order for you to kind of recap on what happened.
I think that's the one, isn't it?
Maybe. I'm not very sure at the moment. This is the highway actually.
Caution,
All right.
terrain.
We have a caution terrain.
Terrain.
Pull up.
Pull up. Terrain.
Full powers
Pull up.
set.
Terrain.
20 degrees.
Pull up.
25.
Terrain.
Speed decreasing. Yeah, radial altimeter increasing.
20 degrees. Okay, so we can keep 20 degrees and then intermittent stick shaker if we need it.
AFM. 20 degrees. And radial altimeter increasing.
Okay, we'll see this.
Terrain.
Pull up.
Terrain. Pull up.
Okay, intermittent stick shaker here, okay?
Speed is decreasing, speed is still good. Radial altimeter increasing.
Airspeed low.
Pitch limit indicator. We still have a caution.
Caution.
That's the intermittent
Still
stick
have
shaker there.
Terrain.
Radial altimeter decreasing.
Terrain.
We have pull up.
Terrain. Pull up. Terrain. Pull up.
Radial altimeter decreasing.
Pull up.
We are climbing.
Terrain. Pull up.
Radial altimeter decreasing.
Pull up. Terrain. Pull
Radial
up.
altimeter radial altimeter decreasing.
Pull up. Terrain. Pull up.
Radial altimeter decreasing slowly.
Pull up. Terrain. Pull up.
Speed.
Terrain.
Radial altimeter decreasing. Radial altimeter decreasing. Decreasing. Now radial altimeter increasing. Radial altimeter increasing.
Oh man.
Radial altimeter increasing. Bank.
Okay, so here you can clearly see that I'm turning in towards terrain, and instead of continuing the turn towards the runway or turning towards lower terrain, I execute the terrain escape maneuver. Why is that? Well, in order to understand this, you have to understand the kind of position that you find yourself in if you ever get this kind of warning. First of all, you should never, ever, ever find yourself having to do a terrain escape maneuver. And that's because before we do any kind of approach, we thoroughly brief it. We make sure that both of us is aware of what's going to happen. And we have something around the airport called an MSA, which is a minimum sector altitude. And whenever we're not on a approach procedure, we will make sure that we're always over that or under positive radar control. Now, the MSA will give us at least 1,000 feet separation to any obstacle within a 25 nautical mile area. Okay, so that stops us from getting close to terrain. When we're flying en route, we fly according to something called a MORA, which is minimum en route altitude. And that MORA will give us 1,000 feet separation to terrain, and in some case 2,000 feet separation to terrain, depending on how the terrain is. So that means that anytime that you find yourself with a hard terrain warning, something has gone terribly wrong. Right? You've lost your situational awareness. Something has happened. You have either mistaken where you are, you've done a wrong turn. Something has happened that has degraded your situational awareness to an extent to where you're now facing a terrain threat ahead of you. At that point, there is no room for trying to figure out what's happened. You're too close to the terrain. Okay? You can't start figuring out whether you should turn left, right, or anything. No. Boeing just wants you to execute the terrain escape maneuver, and that is straight ahead, because any turn will degrade your climb performance. Now, the only time that you might consider turning away from terrain is if you've gotten the initial caution terrain warning and you're visual. Okay, so you can clearly see that there's a mountain straight ahead or an obstacle straight ahead, and it's clear to the side. Well, in that case, yes, you can turn visually. But if you find yourself IMC and you get a terrain pull up warning, there's no choice anymore. We don't want pilots to start to think then, or start to question where they are. We just want them to immediately execute this terrain escape maneuver to give them the absolute highest chance of survival. And that is why we do not turn. Okay, the manuals clearly state this. We know that pilots under severe duress, severe stress will not make the best judgment, decisions. They just need to know that when I hear this, we need to do this. Okay, because it has been proven over and over again over the years that this is the safest way of doing it. And I hope that answers your question. Okay guys, that's it. That's what I wanted to show you. I hope that you have no more questions about that. And if you do, once again, into the app, go into the chat, tag @Mentour, and I will try to answer it for you. Right guys, finally, before I go, I just want to send a huge thank you to the sponsor of this episode, which is NordVPN. Now, just 2 months ago, I was in Thailand with my family. And when you're in Thailand and you're on a European network service, you don't really want to use roaming, because that's going to make you poor very quickly. So what you end up doing is looking for public Wi-Fi's, maybe in hotels or even in bars. And when you're doing so, there's a high risk that people might be snooping in on you, trying to steal your data. Using NordVPN, they will make sure that that doesn't happen, okay? They will protect your data, and they will also unlock things like these pesky regional blockages that stops you from watching your favorite Netflix series when you're abroad. NordVPN is also very, very quick service. It has more than 4,800 servers worldwide that keeps updating all the time to give you the best internet access as quickly as possible. And they even work in China and in the Middle East. So if you're interested in this, you use this link here below together with the coupon code PILOT. You'll get a whopping 75% off their 3-year plan plus 1 month for free. So go and check it out. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Mentor pilot, absolutely fantastic.
I hope you're all doing absolutely fantastic.
Right.
You as well.
Thank you.
Take care, man.
One more time together. Absolutely fantastic.